Long time ago, in a land far away, lived a young girl named Cinderella. Cinderella lived happily ever after with her mother and father. And with the tragic and untimely death of Cinderella's mother, Cinderella's father remarries a cold, cruel woman named Lady Tremaine. Her father takes her and moves in with Lady Tremaine and her two daughters, Drizella and Anastasia. During that time, Cinderella's father passes away, and Lady Tremaine, the wicked stepmother, turns Cinderella into a servant in her own home. Meanwhile, across town in the castle, the king determines that his son the prince should find a suitable bride and provide him with the required number of grandchildren. The king then invites every eligible maiden in the kingdom to a fancy dress ball, where his son will be able to choose his bride. Cinderella has no suitable party dress for a ball, but her friends the mice, led by Gus and Jack, and the birds lend a hand in making her one, only for the stepsisters to immediately tear it apart on the evening of the ball. At this point, enter the fairy godmother, the pumpkin carriage, the royal ball, the stroke of midnight, the glass slipper, and the rest, as they say, is fairy tale history. The Cinderella effect, dubbed by psychologists, isn't about a pretty young girl who gets her happily ever after. The Cinderella effect is the phenomenon of higher incidences where different forms of child abuse and mistreatment by step-parents are carried out. Psychologists describe the effect as a byproduct of a bias towards kin, and a conflict arises between the partners when the biological parent of the child only invests in them only, and not the one that is unrelated to the other partner. In other words, it is when a step-parent mistreats their stepchildren because they are unrelated by blood. Looking back at Greg and Jessica's relationship, there was no visible evidence that Jessica and Greg thought any less of each other. Furthermore, there was no evidence that the relationship was any different that of a typical stepfather and stepdaughter, and certainly nothing sexual in nature. Remember, Jessica considered Greg her second father, and Jessica's mother, Danelle, had repeatedly stated that Greg was a good stepfather and was always there when Jessica needed him. So what possessed Greg to perform the unthinkable, most vile act to a person that had been in his life for over 17 years? In part 2, we will dive deeper into Greg Graf's past and try to get an understanding of what went wrong in Greg's mind and how Jessica became a victim of Greg's sick fantasy. You're listening to Departed in Pennsyltucky, Part 2, The Step Loser, The Case of Jessica Padgett. Date: January 30th, 2015. Location: Northampton County Courthouse, Easton, Pennsylvania. For thousands of years, the New Year has been a festival of rebirth and reflection, allowing people all over the world to celebrate another great year. For many of us, New Year's marks a date of happiness and a clean slate. For many celebrating the new year, it is their opportunity to learn from the prior year and make positive changes in their life beginning on the first of the year. For Jessica's family and friends, it was the complete opposite. The new year of 2015 marked the beginning, the long, hard, cold beginning of holding Greg Graf accountable for the senseless murder of his stepdaughter Jessica, who often referred to him as her second dad. And for Danelle, Jessica's mother, it was a time for her to make necessary changes as well. No longer taking picturesque hunting trips with her husband, nor was she picking out finishes for the home in Florida she was building with Greg. Danelle was now in the process of hiring a divorce attorney, which he had done late in 2014. The start of 2015 had Danelle officially starting divorce proceedings against the man she slept side by side with for the past 17 years. The same man she ran a successful business with. The same man she planned to retire with. And lastly, the same man who took away her only daughter in such an evil and selfish act of violence that many were still trying to understand. On January 16th, 2015, Danelle officially filed paperwork to start divorce proceedings from Greg after 17 years of marriage, stating that Greg's actions had made her life conditions intolerable and life burdensome. In court documents, Danelle claimed Greg handled the family finances, and on December 10th, 2014, she visited their financial advisor to go over the couple's finances. At that time, she learned that 60% of their holdings were in Greg's name alone, and 32% were in joint accounts he could access at any time. Following his arrest, both agreed that any withdrawals, transfers, or spending he made from their assets would have to be approved by both of them. But on December 22nd, 2014, Danelle discovered that Greg withdrew $60,000 without any approval from her. Apparently, Greg made this withdrawal so he could hire a defense attorney. Danelle also asked that the court divide and distribute their assets. She requested a judge to order that Greg pay for her divorce attorney until a final decision was reached. Presiding over the divorce case was Judge Stephen Beretta, and he immediately issued an order that barred Greg from spending the couple's assets. But although Greg was embroiled in his legal battle of a divorce, it would prove to be a minor hurdle, because he was about to face even a bigger legal hurdle: standing trial for the murder of Jessica and then sexually assaulting her corpse. That day, on January 30th, 2015, family and friends of Jessica's were packed into 4 rows of the audience for what promised to be a gut-wrenching testimony for the preliminary hearing at the courthouse in Easton, Pennsylvania. The hearing was to showcase the evidence that supported counts of homicide and abuse of a corpse that Greg had been charged with. Among those present in the courtroom that day were Danelle, Jessica's mother, and Thomas, Jessica's father. During the preliminary hearing, Greg showed no acknowledgement of those people who at one time were his family and friends. And for Greg, None of his actual family appeared in court in support of him. At the time of the hearing, Greg was being held in Northampton County Prison without bail. He was escorted to the defense table by deputy sheriffs, still in handcuffs and shackles, and a prison jumpsuit. As Greg sat down, an unidentified woman wiped her eyes with a tissue. Tears and sniffles could be heard from other family members who looked at Greg. Their expressions were varied, ranging from sadness to anger. Greg sat next to his hired prominent defense attorney, Jack McMahon. Jack was a former Philadelphia homicide prosecutor and had been in practice for nearly 4 decades and had a reputation as a strong trial attorney. Greg hired Jack McMahon days after he was brought before Northampton County presiding judge Stephen Beretta back in December of 2014, after filing an application for a public defender. Because of his wealth, Judge Beretta denied Greg's request, which caught Greg off guard. Greg stated his reasoning for requesting a public defender and said it was to avoid spending money that his family could otherwise use. He stated that his assets were held jointly with his wife Danelle, Jessica's mother, and he did not wish to deplete them. He reiterated his reasoning by saying, "Like I said, I don't want to take away the funds from the family." Greg's explanation was blasted by John Morganelli, who said Greg's own financial disclosures to the public defender's office showed that he could afford an attorney. Speaking to the judge directly, John Morganelli stated that Greg would rather waste the taxpayer money on his own defense than his own. Judge Beretta agreed with John Morganelli and planned to appoint an attorney to represent Greg, who would then be responsible for reimbursing the county for the cost. Judge Beretta told Greg, "You're not going to be able to escape paying for the resources of an attorney. I just can't allow that." Greg responded with, "It doesn't sound like you're giving me a lot of choices," and conceded that he will have to find a lawyer. Fast forward to that particular day in court. Greg, sitting in the courtroom, was somewhat familiar to him and brought back memories. In 1995, Greg entered a guilty plea in Lehigh County Court. Greg was caught with 10 pounds of marijuana and was charged with possession with intent to deliver drugs and conspiracy, for which he served a 3 to 23-month jail sentence. Back in November of 2014, while searching for Jessica at Greg and Danelle's home, police found that Greg had a marijuana growing operation at the home where the killing occurred. According to a search warrant, police seized 13 bags of marijuana, $42,000 in cash, and envelopes containing marijuana seeds from a safe in the basement of Greg and Danelle's home. Police also found evidence of a former marijuana grow company and an exterior building on the property, and confiscated a marijuana horticulture book, pipes, and a vaporizer, and other paraphernalia. Whether Greg was actually dealing marijuana or just growing it, police believe the drugs were not connected to Jessica's killing on November 21, 2014. Before the hearing began, District Attorney John Morganelli said the specific evidence regarding the case should have advanced the case to county court rather quickly, and had described Jessica's murder as a bizarre case. He alleged that Greg was motivated by a desire to have sex with Jessica's corpse, an act police say Greg video recorded. At the time, prosecutors sought out a conviction for first-degree murder, which would have brought an automatic sentence of life in prison without parole. But shortly after everyone had taken their seats, John Morganelli and Greg's defense attorney, Jack McMahon, ducked into a side room where a state police investigator sat with a laptop. In the side room, the video was played by Trooper Raymond Judge as several other investigators, John Morganelli, Assistant District Attorney Patricia Mulqueen, and a seated Jack McMahon looked on. Inside, away from the public, they watched the video that Greg produced of himself having sex with Jessica's corpse. Shot on 2 cameras, it was powerful enough evidence that minutes later, Jack McMahon went before Senior Judge Leonard Zito and said Greg was giving up his right to a preliminary hearing on the charges, a rare occurrence in a homicide case, because most likely, Greg didn't want to see that video again in the courtroom. After the court proceedings, Jack McMahon raised the possibility of a mental health defense, saying that Greg may have suffered an instantaneous mental health breakdown. In his few court appearances, Greg had appeared to be aware of his surroundings and answered questions from court officials with little problem. In his defense argument, Greg tried to pursue some combination of insanity, mental illness, or diminished capacity defenses. Defense attorney Jack McMahon said that Greg was being evaluated by a specialist in Philadelphia. At the time, Greg had previously requested he be housed in a Philadelphia prison as he awaited trial, and that Greg had an instantaneous mental health breakdown the day of the homicide, November 21st, 2014. Jack McMahon called what happened situational and said, "It's not like the defendant planned it." Mental health defenses can involve the claim that a defendant is not guilty by reason of insanity, though that is rare and extremely hard to prove in court. But mental health can also be used to argue a defendant is guilty of a lesser degree of homicide and lack the specific intent to kill that is required for a first-degree murder. District Attorney John Morganelli countered Jack McMahon's statement in that he believed there is very strong evidence of premeditated murder, and he described this case as an instance where the kill is part of the excitement. You make a kill, and then you have sex with the body. John Morganelli also said he was not surprised by the filing, and he doubted Greg's defense would be successful. He himself didn't believe that Greg had any illness, such as mental health issues, or any health problems, or even the diminished capacity that would prevent him from forming a specific intent to kill. Under Pennsylvania law, defendants must prove they had a psychotic breakdown, meaning that they saw and heard things that did not exist, in order to be found not guilty by reason of insanity. Defendants can be found guilty, but mentally ill of a charge where a mental health issue compels them to commit a crime they otherwise know is wrong. Necrophilia is best described as sexual arousal stimulated by a dead body. Necrophiliacs get sexually excited by fantasies about or actual contact with a corpse. Dr. Philip Resnick, an internationally known forensic psychiatrist who has studied necrophilia, said in his research he has made a distinction between a true necrophiliac, which is someone who seeks a body to have sex with, and a pseudo-necrophiliac, someone who has sex with a body when presented the opportunity. Dr. Resnick himself questioned whether Greg killed to have sex with Jessica's corpse, or did he attempt to have sex, was rejected, then subsequently killed Jessica and then had sex with her. At the time, authorities stated there was no evidence that Greg had anything other than a parental relationship with Jessica. The allegation that Greg videotaped himself having sex with Jessica's dead body also did not surprise Dr. Fred Berlin, a sexual disorders expert who testified at the trial of serial killer Jeffrey Dahmer. Founder of the Johns Hopkins Sexual Disorders Clinic and director of its Sexual Behaviors Unit, Dr. Berlin noted that there is an internet community of people who share an interest in having sex with corpses. He said the struggle with the internet is determining which accounts are real or just fantasy. Dr. Berlin said necrophilia is exceedingly rare, but can often lead to tragic circumstances. As with most sexual perversions, necrophilia is usually committed by males between the ages of 20 and 50. Some necrophiliacs seek jobs that give them access to corpses, such as morgue attendants and cemetery caretakers. After the preliminary hearing, most of Jessica's family and friends refused to comment. But Jim Wilkins, a family friend and neighbor, who was the original organizer of the volunteer search for Jessica, said the family didn't expect to get any answers as to why Greg targeted Jessica. He said, "We are trying to wrap our heads around this and come up with a rationale. It's never going to make any sense to any of us, because we don't think like that. A normal, rational person isn't going to comprehend it." Greg's stepfather, Samuel Smack, said he and his wife had been telling their friends that it's best not to talk about the case. He and his wife Hilda were devastated by the allegations. "Nothing but negativity has come out. Stuff that isn't true about him," he said, who at the time, his dad was 83 years old. "There's a lot of stuff going out there that's not really true, and it upsets us terribly. It has just torn the family apart." Robert Borman, an acquaintance who had hunted with Greg, said that in the aftermath of the arrest, people had tried to piece together clues to Greg's character. "Only one thing, a minor one, has stood out," he said. Quote, "He was self-centered. Now, does that make you a killer and a necrophiliac? I don't know." But one main question remained on many people's minds. Why wasn't this case a death penalty case? Even though disturbing, Greg shooting Jessica in the back of the head, sexually abusing her corpse, then dumping her body on his 7-acre property, prosecutors stated they lacked an aggravating factor to justify capital murder charges. District Attorney John Morganelli said because the sexual abuse occurred after and not before, he was unable to seek the death penalty. At the time of the trial, Pennsylvania law recognized only 18 circumstances under which someone convicted of a first-degree murder can be sentenced to death. The killing of a police officer is one. Multiple victims is another. A murder involving rape qualifies as well. The murder of a child under the age of 12 is another one. But sadly, the sexual abuse of a corpse does not. Date: November 2nd, 2015. Location: Northampton County Courthouse, Easton, Pennsylvania. Almost a year to the date when Jessica was killed, 70 Northampton County residents sat in the courthouse in Easton, waiting to get a glimpse of Greg Graf, the man who was accused of killing his stepdaughter Jessica, then sexually abusing her corpse, all the while videotaping the unspeakable event. Before the jury pool was brought in, Greg sat clad in green sweatpants, white Nike sneakers, and a t-shirt advertising his fencing company, Distinctive Fence. But in an attempt to win the jury over, he changed into a suit jacket and maroon shirt that his lawyer Jack McMahon had delivered. And throughout the jury selection process, Greg's attorney asked very few questions. Of the 70 jury pool, all but 19 said they had seen media reporting on the case, though they all indicated to Jack McMahon they would be able to set aside that and not form a bias against Greg. Jack McMahon then asked the jury pool whether they'd hold Greg's silence against him if he decided not to testify, and whether they'd be willing to consider a degree of homicide less than first-degree murder. Jack McMahon told the jury he understands that the circumstances of the case are upsetting, and had asked if those tragic circumstances affect the ability of anyone there deciding the level of homicide. They answered, none. In his statements to the jury pool, District Attorney John Morganelli had planned to offer the potential jury the shocking accusation that after Greg shot Jessica in the back of the head, he had sex with her corpse, all the while videotaping it. And although Greg tried to erase the video recordings he made of himself sexually abusing Jessica's corpse, police were still able to recover them. The recording was 6 to 7 minutes long, and John Morganelli warned the men and women of the jury pool that it was sexually explicit and it may be played at the trial. John Morganelli asked the panel, "Will you be able to handle watching that?" All members of the jury pool were very clear how uncomfortable watching the footage would be for them. "I will not watch it," said one young man. "You can't watch it?" Morganelli asked. "I won't watch it," the man corrected. But while those jurors said they couldn't face the disturbing evidence, jury selection in the case went rather quickly, and in the end, the final jury was made up of 9 men and 3 women. Date: August 3rd, 2015. Location: Northampton County Courthouse, Easton, Pennsylvania. The month of August is a hot one for many of us living in the United States. In Pennsylvania, the month of August is notoriously humid and muggy, with many of us seeking refuge inside as the cool air provided by air conditioning takes out the damp mugginess in the air and makes overall living more enjoyable. That day, on August 3rd, 2015, the air conditioning was no doubt working on high capacity at the Northampton County Courthouse in Easton, for this was the only creature comfort available to Jessica's family, friends, and co-workers. For this hot and humid day was the opening of Greg's murder trial, and prosecutor John Morganelli outlined at length the evidence authorities gathered to prove that Greg murdered Jessica, then sexually abused her corpse. In his opening arguments, District Attorney John Morganelli stated that Greg planned the killing meticulously, knowing that his wife Danelle would be in Florida at the time. Afterwards, he abandoned Jessica's car in the parking lot in Northampton, where he had arranged to leave his truck earlier in the day, allowing him to ditch her vehicle and return home to where her body remained. But his accounts of his whereabouts were contradicted as police checked the details. Video surveillance from a gas station where Greg claimed to have bought lunch showed he was not there at the time he indicated. John Morganelli also demonstrated the steps that Greg took to conceal his crime, which they said was a case of premeditated murder. The day before killing Jessica, Greg was seen on video buying toys at a sex shop in Allentown, Pennsylvania. On Friday, November 21st, 2014, the afternoon that Jessica was killed, Greg's employees stopped by his property to be paid for the week, and Greg acted normally, handing out each employee their paycheck, even as Jessica's body lay in a nearby room. John Morganelli added that Greg killed to satisfy his sexual fantasy, and he videotaped the crime for his viewing pleasure at a later date. It was only afterwards, hours after shooting Jessica in the back of the head, that Greg sexually abused Jessica's corpse, placing a plastic bag over her head and video recording his act on 2 cameras. The video made it absolutely clear that Jessica was dead at the time, and the acts are clearly consistent with what he said. John Morganelli said, "He knew what he was doing was wrong, and he tried to cover his steps." When John Morganelli finished his presentation, Greg's lawyer, Jack McMahon, stepped before the jury and did something he said he has rarely done in a long career of representing criminal defendants. He told the jury outright that Greg was a guilty man. He went on to say that Greg indeed did murder Jessica and video recorded himself performing sex acts on her corpse. And as Jack McMahon provided a reason as to why Greg snapped, Greg was seen dabbing his eyes with a tissue. Jack McMahon argued, while Greg knew what he did was wrong and deserves to be punished dearly for it, he shouldn't be convicted of premeditated murder, and instead argued for a third-degree murder verdict, which only carried a sentence of 10 to 20 years. Jack McMahon said, "Something snapped in this good man's mind on that date. Something happened that wasn't planned. When it was time for the prosecution to present its witnesses, Jessica's husband Micah and co-workers from the Duck Duck Goose daycare testified about the final morning they saw her alive. Jessica's co-workers described her leaving for work to send a fax at Greg and Danelle's home, then never returning. Jessica's husband Micah told the jury he had gone to work early November 21st, 2014, while Jessica and the 3 children were asleep. That afternoon, he got a phone call from one of Jessica's co-workers saying she had left and never returned. Micah said he got increasingly worried as he called his wife's cell phone and got no answer. He also phoned Greg's office and spoke with Greg personally. I asked him if he'd seen Jess. He told me no, Micah said. He said he just recently walked through the door. Choking back tears, Caitlin Foley, one of Jessica's co-workers, testified that Greg phoned Jessica 3 times at the Duck Duck Goose daycare where she worked in Northampton. Caitlin said Jessica told her Greg needed help with an Excel computer file, and she needed to go to his house anyway to fax up medical paper. They went on to testify that Greg was persistent in his phone calls to get Jessica to come to his home. Shannon Tumini, another one of Jessica's co-workers, started crying when she recalled giving Jessica permission to leave briefly to send the fax at Greg's house. Her phone was ringing nonstop, she said. She was going to go after work, but he kept calling her and stressing her out. During her testimony, Shannon had abruptly shielded her eyes and turned her head from Greg, who sat at the defense table. Tell him to stop looking at me, Shannon pleaded. Please? But more often than not, Shannon struggled to keep her composure and broke into sobs at one point, prompting Judge Stephen Beretta to call for a recess. When it was Danelle's turn to testify, she sat rigid with emotion as she described the tales her husband Greg told her after Jessica disappeared and before he confessed to state police on November 26, 2014. Danelle said she knew Greg for 22 years and had been married to him for 17 years. Danelle testified she learned about Jessica's November 21st, 2014 disappearance when she was in Florida choosing carpets for their new home. When Greg picked her up at Lehigh Valley International Airport on November 22, 2014, he said it would be okay. They'd find her. Even though the browsing history on Greg's computer showed searches for landfills in the Lehigh Valley, Donnell said she had not conducted those internet searches. 2 days before Greg's arrest, Donnell testified that she allowed police to search their property. During her testimony, she pointed out a pair of tan sandals to police, a pair she said Greg always wore. They were missing their straps, which police found in a basement garbage can beside a washer and dryer. The straps were stained, and a chemical test indicated the presence of blood. At first, Greg denied Jessica had been at their home, Donnell said, but as the search for her continued through November 25, 2014, Greg told Donnell that he came home on the afternoon of November 21st, 2014, only to find Jessica's car in their driveway and blood stains on the carpet. He said he panicked, Donnell said. He said if he told the truth, no one would believe him. She said Greg told her he moved Jessica's car because he was afraid police would suspect him. Throughout the search, he told her a couple times that he wouldn't hurt her. Greg then told Donnell he suspected Jessica owed somebody money, and they were really mad and they were going to hurt her. As Greg confessed to police in their home on November 26, 2014, as police led him away from the home, he looked at her and said, "I love you." That was the last time she saw him before the trial. Donnell said she spoke to him 3 times on the phone from prison. The first time, they discussed the family fence installation business and finances. The second call was on Christmas Eve, when she said she was not in a very good place and took his phone call against her better judgment. Greg called Danielle to wish her a Merry Christmas, and she stated, "All I remember about that call was screaming at him." She didn't say what happened during the third call, but said she never accepted one of his many other calls from prison and never sought an explanation from Greg regarding the charges he was facing. She said, "I knew at that point he wouldn't tell me the truth anyway." Lastly, Donnell testified that she never used sex toys with Greg during their entire relationship. At times during the testimony, members of the audience would leave as difficult evidence was presented. When it came time to present physical evidence, jurors were shown photos of Jessica's lifeless body as it was hidden by Greg on his 7-acre property. Jessica was wrapped in a blood-stained comforter that was covered in leaves and other debris. Photos show the progression as authorities uncovered her corpse. One picture showed just Jessica's left hand, a ring on her ring finger, and Jessica had been face down. More evidence showed bloodstains on the straps of his favorite sandals. A paper towel in the garbage by investigators also tested positive for blood, and the can also contained a product designed for cleaning the inside of washing machines. Other photos showed reddish-brown stains on the floor of his basement near a billiard table. Among the items displayed to the jury was the weapon Greg told police he shot Jessica with, a .22 caliber gun, and the packaging from sex toys that Greg bought in Allentown the day before the killing. The evidence caused some of Jessica's loved ones to flee the courtroom and others to keep their eyes downcast, holding hands and passing tissues. On the stand, a forensic pathologist testified that Jessica was shot in the back of the head at close range. She had no other injuries indicating any struggle. The testimony was consistent with Greg's account to police of what happened. Witness after witness recalled Greg acting normally in their interactions with him, even telling jokes and talking business. When it was time to cross-examine Jessica's family, friends, and co-workers, Greg's attorney repeatedly asked the witnesses whether there was anything in Greg's relationship with Jessica that had concerned them beforehand. Repeatedly, they said there wasn't. Among them was Jessica's mother, Danielle. What your husband did came as a complete and utter surprise to you? Jack McMahon suggested to Danielle. Yes, sir, Danielle said weakly. 29-year-old Kaylee Hillgrass, a friend of Jessica's sister, said she saw Greg at his house the evening after the killing, and he denied seeing Jessica that day. Kaylee said that as they spoke, Greg excused himself, saying his hands were cracking from the cold. He took a tissue and wiped his hands and his foot, then threw the tissue away, she said. It wasn't a lot of blood, but it was blood, she said. Prosecutors stated that the cleaning supplies Greg bought at a local hardware store were used to remove blood stains in the home. The manager of Miller Supply Ace Hardware on Route 329 in Northampton testified that on Saturday, November 22nd, 2014, the day after Jessica's murder, Greg came into his store on Route 329 and purchased a mop and cleaning supplies such as bleach and floor cleaner. The purchases totaled $35.46 and also included bottles of carpet and floor cleaner. While testifying on the stand, John Morganelli asked him if those were the type of supplies that Greg normally would purchase, and the manager said no. Other witnesses testifying for the prosecution said they saw blood stains on Greg's carpet in the area where he allegedly shot Jessica. Greg told one witness the blood was from his dog's urine. State Trooper Raymond Judge testified that 2 days before the discovery of her body, Greg used his computer to search Google for landfills in the Lehigh Valley, then arranged for a trash bin containing Jessica's clothing to be hauled away. Employees for Marth Disposal testified Greg called them quickly to remove a dumpster. The owner of the trash removal company, Roger Marth, testified he was surprised to get an early morning call from Greg asking for service that day. Normally, Danielle would phone the company, and that usually happened in the afternoon. I don't think I've ever heard from him that early in the morning, Roger said of Greg. Another employee of the disposal service, Sean Holland, said he was surprised to find Greg's trash bin only half filled. So he called his boss just to make sure Greg wanted it taken away. He said, "Usually when I go there, stuff is sticking out of the top." Even so, state police were able to track down the garbage inside to find Jessica's bloody clothes. In order to keep people away from the area where Greg dumped Jessica's body, Greg kept searching volunteers away from where Jessica's body was dumped. Heather Fuchs, Greg's daughter, testified that Greg pointed to the backyard and said, "I already searched down there." Heather remembered her father crying and thanking her for coming to look for Jessica. "He seemed worried and he didn't know where Jess was," she said. Heather's husband, John Fuchs, added that Greg claimed he was worried that someone had abducted Jessica. He was afraid to come out of the house or answer the door because he was scared they were coming for him. He also testified that Greg seemed concerned about a police helicopter searching for Jessica the weekend she went missing. As it got closer, he started asking about infrared on the helicopter, John Fuchs said. Then, Greg's recorded confession with Pennsylvania State Police was played for the jury and the courtroom. In an interview with police, November 24th, 2014, Greg acknowledged Karen Gundrum, his neighbor, hadn't driven him as he claimed. Instead, Greg said he arrived at his home November 21st, 2014, and found Jessica's vehicle in his driveway, but she was nowhere to be found. Greg stated in his interview November 24th, 2014, that Jessica had told him previously that she was in financial trouble and people were after her, so he grew fearful and panicked. He related that he drove her car from his home and parked it in the parking lot where it was discovered. All along, authorities really believed that Greg shot Jessica inside the house around 1 p.m., then drove her car to the Northampton parking lot where he abandoned it, then walked to where his truck was parked, claiming his truck was there to be worked on. Even workers at Harhart's service station told investigators that Greg never contacted them about doing work on his vehicle. Even more of Greg's details about that day were contradictory as police checked the details. Video surveillance from a gas station where Greg claimed to have bought lunch showed he was not there the time he indicated. Knowing there were holes in Greg's story, detectives decided to put the pressure on and asked Greg to come down to the police station to conduct an interview. In that interview with state police on November 26, 2014, Greg admitted he killed Jessica, then sexually assaulted her after she was dead, and, quote, secreted her body hidden in the rear under a large amount of leaves and brush on his nearly 7-acre property, wrapped in a blanket. The confession was made abruptly in a police interview room at the Pennsylvania State Police Barracks in Bethlehem, ending days of denial, evasions, and changing stories from Greg, who had repeatedly tried to explain how Jessica went missing after coming to his home to send a fax. He said he got a crazy feeling, something sexual in nature, Trooper Senzina testified. In his 36-minute audio recording of his confession at Pennsylvania State Police Barracks, Greg admitted he shot Jessica in the back of the head as she sat by a fax machine at his house, saying he neither spoke nor gave warning before taking her life. Throughout his interview with police, Greg insisted he was not an evil man. He claimed he couldn't understand what in his past drove him to kill Jessica and sexually abuse her corpse. After days of lying to authorities, he confessed to his crime, speaking rather matter-of-factly, his voice occasionally breaking with emotion. He was quoted as saying, "I'm not really a bad guy, and I just lost my mind temporarily. I don't want to hurt anybody," and he knew what he did was wrong, but still tried to cover it up. He called what happened hell and a nightmare. He said, "I wasn't thinking. I thought I can get away with something." At that point, my mind was still spinning, basically thinking of sex for whatever reason. During that time, I tried the video. I don't even know why. On the recording, Greg says he couldn't fathom his actions. He says he remembered a peeping Tom incident when he was a boy in Bucks County, but denies ever fantasizing about violence. He watches a lot of porn, he told the investigators, and had been viewing some before Jessica arrived, and explaining why he, an avid hunter and owner of numerous firearms, took a .22 caliber handgun from a closet, walked up to Jessica, and executed her at point-blank range. Greg said that only a crazy thought had come into his mind. Did you say anything to her when you shot her? Trooper Senzina asked on the recording. No, I did not. Did she know you were going to shoot her, he asked. No, absolutely not, Greg says, his voice catching. Trooper Senzina said Greg recounted that after the shooting, he dragged Jessica's body from his office and placed it in a spare bedroom on the first floor. After the hours passed, Greg acted normally as employees of his fencing company, Distinctive Fence, returned from work, even as her body lay nearby. Greg said it was only after the workers were gone that he abused Jessica's corpse, lifting her onto a bed and performing the sex acts. According to Trooper Barton Josevitz, he said he didn't want to look at her, and the blood was freaking him out. Trooper Josevitz said Greg admitted he killed Jessica to have sex with her body, and pointed out that he hadn't chosen his neighbor, 46-year-old Karen Gundrum. Remember, this is the same woman who Greg said had driven him to a service station to pick up his truck. In her interview with investigators, Karen stated she had done no such thing, and also related that Greg had asked her to lie about that detail to his stepson Jeremy. It seemed Greg asked her for an alibi, and little did she know, she could have been his next victim instead. Referring to killing Karen instead of Jessica, Greg said, "I would have gotten away with it. No one would ever know." Trooper Senzina said at one point early on as Greg spoke, Greg looked out the window and saw it had started snowing. He looked at me and said, "Aren't you going to go get her?" After the recording was played for the courtroom and jury, Jack McMahon highlighted those portions in which Greg expressed remorse and shock. Greg's attorney tried to highlight some of Greg's phases, that everything was a blur, that, quote, "I didn't plan anything," and that while he thinks about sex a lot, I never ever hurt anybody. John Morganelli countered by suggesting that in the moments in which Greg expressed pity, it was only in talking about himself and his future, and not about Jessica. Jurors also listened to recordings of Greg calling his answering service around the time he allegedly killed Jessica. He was joking with the operators, calling one of them sleepy. Listening to Greg's confession in an open courtroom proved to be a difficult day for Jessica's family. And the toughest moment was yet to come. The following day, District Attorney John Morganelli planned to wrap up his case and to present the 6 to 7 minute video that Greg recorded of himself sexually abusing Jessica's corpse, whose head he had covered in a plastic bag. Throughout testimony, the mere mention of the video carried emotional baggage. It was one thing to describe the recordings, which show Greg performing sex acts on Jessica's corpse several hours after he killed her. But it's another thing to actually view them. Beforehand, Judge Beretta had warned jurors that they should not allow the video to unduly sway their emotions, a cautionary instruction typical when potentially inflammatory evidence is presented. Judge Beretta told the panel that from what he understood, the video was not pleasant, maybe quite upsetting. He said, "Please know, if you don't feel comfortable watching the entire video, you don't have to watch the entire video." One juror's eyes filled with tears while the video played. Another's face twisted into a look of profound distaste. Another sat motionless with his hand over his mouth, his fingers pinching his eyes. The courtroom was silent. Shot in the basement of Greg and Danelle's home, the video was made up of 8 recordings that were shot by Greg over a span of 2 hours, using 2 cameras. It was presented on a screen that was purposely placed away from the view of the audience, where many members of Jessica's family sat. Others chose to stay away, including Donnell and Jessica's father, Thomas, who took their seats only after it was over. Even the sounds from the recordings were unbearable to hear, with Greg at one point speaking profanely to Jessica's lifeless body, whose head he had covered in a plastic bag. The actual images were even worse. Jack McMahon, Greg's attorney, didn't look at the screen as the video played. Instead, he kept his eyes averted and swiveled his chair away. Greg also did not look, busying himself reading court papers in front of him. The only noise beyond the recordings was the occasional voice of Assistant District Attorney Patricia Mulqueen. As each video ended, she said, "Okay, the next video, please." The jurors all made it through, but even though when it was over, they sat quietly with vacant expressions even several minutes later. When it came time to show the jury the sex toys that Greg purchased 2 days before Jessica's murder, her father Thomas and her mother Donnell each looked away as Corporal Jason Troutman walked the plastic containers past the jury box. But in the moments before Corporal Troutman showed the actual devices to the panel, Thomas and Donnell exited the courtroom, escorted by victim advocates. They left behind a silent courtroom where one juror sat with arms folded and barely glanced as the state trooper slowly passed with one of the devices. Jessica's husband, Micah, remained in the courtroom through it all, his head down and his hands cradling his forehead. The only sounds were the occasional crying of Jessica's family and friends as they struggled to keep their composure. District Attorney John Morganelli said he watched the jurors and said nearly all were able to watch the series of recordings, although several in the jury appeared to look away at times. In cases with graphic testimony with the potential to traumatize jurors, federal judges are empowered to get counseling for them. John Morganelli said he's heard of counseling offered to jurors in some federal cases, but it wasn't something he necessarily would support at a county level. He said, "That's not our role and that's not our responsibility. We asked the jurors beforehand and warned them what the evidence would include, and if they couldn't do it, and if it was too traumatizing for them, they were excused." While there is no mechanism in place in Pennsylvania for juror counseling, judges do have the discretion to order counseling be made available to jurors. Finally, the defense rested its case without calling Greg to testify, nor without calling any other witnesses. In his closing arguments, District Attorney John Morganelli said Greg planned the killing meticulously, knowing that Donnell would be in Florida at the time. Afterwards, he abandoned Jessica's car in Northampton, where he had arranged to leave his truck earlier the day. Allowing him to ditch her vehicle and return home to where her body remained. Speaking to the jury during closing arguments, Jack McMahon labeled the killing an evil act, but insisted that it was also a shock to Greg that it was not premeditated. "6 minutes. Here is a short list one can do in 6 minutes. Brew and drink a cup of coffee. Go through your spam folder in your email. Fold a load of towels. Clean a couple of windows. Check Instagram. Look up a recipe on Pinterest. Apply makeup. Dust a room. Clean out your purse. Eat Nutella straight from the jar. Scoop your cat's litter box. Check your bank balance online. Brew and drink another cup of coffee. Open a package from Zara and realize that your Kohl's shirt you ordered is too tight in the bust. "6 minutes was also the length of the video Greg recorded of himself sexually abusing Jessica's corpse after he murdered her. 6 minutes was also the amount of time that a Northampton County jury took before convicting Greg of first-degree murder, as well as being guilty of abusing Jessica's corpse. He was condemned to life in prison without parole. After days of listening to gut-wrenching testimony in the murder trial of Greg Graf, and then watching the grisly video of him sexually abusing Jessica's corpse, jurors stepped into a small room and began their work. It capped an emotional trial, an equally emotional final day of testimony. After the door shut, jury foreman Dave Holub got deliberations underway by asking for a show of hands. All hands shot up in agreement on both of the charges against Greg that took about a minute, much less time than filling out the paperwork on the verdict slip. Dave said, "It felt so good to be there and say guilty." Back in the Northampton County courtroom minutes later, Dave looked directly at Jessica's brother Jeremy and nodded. Dave said Jeremy mouthed the words, "Thank you," to him. "In my opinion, he had nothing to thank me for," Dave said. "We did what the law required us to do, and there was absolutely no question about it. It's a crying shame that everyone had to go through all of this." The quick and swift verdict brought tears of relief and gasps of "yes" from the family of Jessica. The emotion only continued after the jury reached a decision, as Jessica's sister Christy Davis confidently walked up to Greg before he was formally sentenced and outed him as a selfish man who stole a beloved woman and shattered a family and a community. "I know you probably don't care what I have to say, but for once someone isn't concerned about you. You're going to listen to what I have to say for Jess and myself." Christy said Greg could have pleaded guilty and taken the punishment he had earned. Instead, he forced Jessica's loved ones to endure excruciating testimony and relive a nightmare, she said. "What I've learned from this trial is that even now you don't regret it. You don't even care," she said. Jessica's mother, Danelle, called Jessica her best friend and said life will never be the same. "We are not here for Mr. Graf," Danelle said. "We are here to be the voice of Jess, who can no longer speak for herself." Presiding Judge Stephen Beretta gave Greg a life sentence and added a 1 to 2 year term on top of that. The maximum on the other charge, a largely symbolic gesture. "This is a crime against human nature, and what you did violates basic family bonds," Judge Beretta told Greg. "Jessica's relatives will have to suffer from this crime for the rest of their life, and my heart goes out to them." Greg said very little before he was led away by deputy sheriffs, and he showed no signs of emotion. Judge Beretta asked him if he had anything to say, and Greg replied, "No, sir. Just that I am very sorry." Afterwards, Jack McMahon said he was unsurprised by the verdict or the quickness in which it was delivered. He said Greg wanted to go to trial because he was adamant that he never planned the killing, and he just wanted everyone to know that. He had a fair trial and the jury spoke. "I understand the verdict, and I really don't quarrel with it all," Jack McMahon said. "It's just an unfortunate, sad day for a lot of people." Jack McMahon called the video horrific and said it is hard to imagine the jury would be sympathetic to Greg after seeing it. "It is what it is. He caused it by doing that, so I can't blame anyone but him." John Morganelli said that with the verdict, justice was done. Although jurors declined to comment as they left court, Jessica's family, however, met with reporters, fighting emotion as they talked of the stress and heartache of the past 4 days, but also smiling as they remembered their Jessica. "The trial was hard as you can believe," said Micah, Jessica's husband. "This is something you prepare yourself for. But once it all starts to happen, all of that is out the window." Micah said he holds 15 years of memories of Jessica that he cherishes, from the birth of their children to their recent marriage. He called Jessica a wonderful person who was the only girl I ever loved. He said, "That's the hardest part of it all. Knowing that you had a future, you had something that was yours, and someone else took it from you." David Holub, the jury's foreman, said he turned to family members for support after the verdict was reached. David spoke with his parents and his wife about the ordeal, but he didn't feel the need for counseling. At the time, the other jurors could not be reached for comment, but David said none of them told him about the concerns after watching the video. Now convicted, Greg joins a short but disturbing list of killers who have committed one of the ultimate taboos. Serial killers Ted Bundy and Ed Gein admitted to sexually abusing the bodies of people they murdered, as did mass murderer Henry Lee Lucas, who reportedly told investigators that he preferred sex with the dead because, quote, "I like peace and quiet." Epilogue. August 15th, 2016. Around 2 years after Jessica was murdered, Christy Davis, Jessica's sister, still found it difficult to get past the loss of her sister and best friend. She says, "I don't remember when my baby was little. I don't remember graduating from college. These things happened when she was taken from me. I was robbed of those things," she said. "Sometimes I feel like it happened yesterday. Sometimes I feel like it's been forever since I had my sister. I still miss her." Because of this, Christy felt the crime of sexual abuse of a corpse should be a crime that merits a death sentence. At the time of Jessica's death, prosecutors didn't have any of the aggravating circumstances needed to pursue the death penalty. With the help of Representative Julie Harhart and Representative Karen Boback, Jessica's Law, otherwise known as House Bill 2284, was authored by both representatives. If voted into law, it would make desecration or mutilation of a corpse during a homicide an aggravating factor that could be considered for a death penalty prosecution. The bill had passed 24-3 and at the time was headed to the House for consideration. Christie said, "At least this law would give Jess justice. At least it would protect other people after what happened to her." At that time, the chairman of the committee stated on Monday, September 30th, 2016, the law would have been moved out of the committee in October. Julie Harhart said the murder happened across the street from her legislative office, and she still gets chills just talking about the case. Jessica's law won't ever restore those memories, but at least it will arm prosecutors with the weapon they need to seek justice on anyone treated as horrifically as Jessica, she said. "Sometimes I feel like it happened yesterday. Sometimes I feel like it's been forever since I've had my sister. I still miss her," says Christie. Unfortunately, Christie, along with everyone else who loved Jessica, will have to wait some more. In October 2016, the proposed Jessica's Law was subsequently laid on the table by the House, and no further actions were taken on the legislation that year. The legislation, having moved no further, failed to become law by the conclusion of the session cycle of 2015 through 2016. Representative Julie Harhart no longer serves in the State House, for she did not seek re-election in 2016. Most recently, Representative Karen Boback had reintroduced Jessica's Law as House Bill 545 of 2021. That version has not received any consideration for a vote to date. If you would like to get Jessica's Law passed in the state of Pennsylvania, please visit Representative Karen Boback's website at www.repboback.com. October 21st, 2016. In a lawsuit filed on October 21st, 2016, Jessica's husband Micah sued Greg for wrongful death of Jessica and intentional infliction of emotional distress. Micah filed the suit on behalf of himself and his two children, ages 10 and 3. James Huber, Micah's attorney, spoke on behalf of his client. He said, "Obviously, the claim is to recover for the children, in the hopes that whatever assets he has could come to them given the horrific circumstances of their mother's death. The suit says Greg's crimes inflicted severe emotional distress upon Micah and their children. It accuses Greg of extreme and outrageous conduct, which goes beyond all possible bounds of decency, and which is atrocious and utterly intolerable in a civilized community. Micah was looking for funeral expenses for Jessica, compensation for her lost wages and retirement benefits, and punitive damages. The suit stated Greg should pay for the family's mental health counseling. At the time, the lawsuit didn't specify any amounts, and as of the airing of this podcast, the status of the lawsuit is unknown. Date: August 7th, 2017. Location: Northampton County Courthouse, Easton, Pennsylvania. In an attempt to seek a new trial, Greg filed an appeal claiming he blacked out after abusing drugs when he killed Jessica. In a handwritten petition, Greg claimed his lawyer, Jack McMahon, was ineffective during his 2015 trial, when a jury took less than 6 minutes to find him guilty of first-degree murder and abuse of a corpse. The 11-page handwritten appeal was written by Greg himself, and the document was an exact replica of the paperwork one would find in the Pennsylvania court system. Greg's handwriting, or shall I say printing, was neat and meticulous. Each section was the exact same wording the court systems would use. Greg was so detailed, he even put underlining in spaces where it needed to be. The paper read more like a professor, rather than the convicted murderer that he was. In the appeal filed July 21st, 2017, Greg said he was high on alcohol, marijuana, and psychedelic mushrooms when he killed Jessica. He claimed he got into an argument with her, blacked out in a fit of anger, and didn't know what he was doing. Referring to that day in November, he wrote that on or about November of 2014, the herein defendant was at his home/place of business. That defendant was under the influence of a mind-altering drugs, mainly mushrooms, alcohol, and marijuana when the victim showed up, requesting to utilize the company's fax machine, and in fact, attempting to commit the crime of fraud. Defendant told the victim that she was not welcome at the home/place of business. That victim was in fact barred and was trespassing due to the fact that victim had been caught stealing from defendant's safe and had also run up a large debt by constantly asking defendant for money to pay off victim's debts. When asked to leave, victim started a fight with defendant. Defendant blacked out in a fit of anger brought on by the drugs and alcohol. Defendant shot and killed victim, and once sober, attempted to cover up what happened. Greg blamed his defense attorney at the time, Jack McMahon, for failing to effectively represent him during the 2015 trial. In his appeal, Greg wrote that he paid Jack McMahon $60,000, but the lawyer didn't call any defense witnesses or file any post-trial motions. That same day, Greg appeared by video feed in Northampton County Court during a hearing over his divorce with Donnell, his once longtime wife, and Jessica's mother. And at the hearing, Greg complained about Jack McMahon and over the financial terms of a February decree that settled his and Donnell's estate. Greg was to receive $130,000 from two mutual funds and to get 25% of the proceeds from the future sale of the couple's second home in Florida. But he insisted he had never agreed to the terms. Describing Greg's appeal as hopeless and frivolous, John Morganelli felt his appeal may be related to his divorce because he'd been unhappy about the freezing of his assets. John Morganelli added, "He skips out the sexual part. How does he justify that?" However, for reasons unknown, Monday, November 27th, 2017, almost 3 years to the day that Jessica was found murdered on his property, Greg withdrew his appeal, stating, "After further review and discussing it with my court-appointed attorney, I feel it is best to withdraw my petition for post-conviction relief." John Morganelli said Greg was not a dumb man and not wanting to come to court because ultimately he would not be able to make his appeal successful. To this day, no further appeals have been made by Greg. He is currently serving his life sentence without the chance of parole at Fayette Correctional Institution, located in LaBelle, Pennsylvania. This concludes this week's episode of Departed in Pennsyltucky. Thank you for listening. Tune in next week for more true crime talk without the Valley Girl squawk. Have a great day, everyone.